Hello,
Hello,
hello.
everybody. Okay, guys. Hey, it's 10:01, or excuse me, it's 1:01. We've got two different time zones here. So, first of all, thank you guys all for joining us again this week, and Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. I hope everyone's made some serious progress on their Christmas shopping. I'm like 2 presents away from being complete, and since this is my first year as a husband, it's a little bit different. And with that came like a whole pack of sister-in-laws, and they all think I'm this really good gift giver. It's weird. I don't know how I got this like title. I'm feeling a lot of pressure, but I'm also feeling like maybe I'll just give them a bunch of guy gifts, and then we'll see how that goes. But anyway, so still working on that. But this is our last ship show of the year, and we are wrapping it up with the classic Freight Market Roundup. If this is your first time joining us on our FMR, welcome. Our goal here is to give you a snapshot of the price averages we've been experiencing across all the major shipping lanes. And this includes air freight. And also, we like to break down some of the current events that are affecting the shipping markets, but touch on things that affect the general business community and just business in general. So we kind of touch on the supply and demand factors that get involved. Now, my name is Jason Brandt. I'm the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. This show is also co-hosted by Anthony D'Ambrosio. He's our Vice President of Sales. He's on vacation, definitely deserved, definitely needed. We told him literally do not join today. So you'll be seeing him again in the new year. Now, behind the scenes, we've got our wonderful Director of Marketing, Vanessa Fry. And I say this weekly, but I promise you this show would not be possible without her consistent just involvement. We've had so many crash and burn episodes, and it's all because she was on vacation. And I was like, oh my God, I can't handle this. So please give it up to Vanessa Fry for making this show possible this last year. Now, we've got an orderly fashion for this show. So over the next 20 minutes, I plan on walking you through all the major shipping lanes. I'm going to start with the Trans-Pacific, then we're going to work our way over to the Transatlantic. And finally, we will finish up our ocean portion talking about the China to Europe lane. I'll follow that up with a discussion about air rates, and then I'll touch on the oil and diesel markets as well. So let's get started. So first things first, most important thing to mention is there's a trend happening across the shipping industry right now, and it's basically that the shipping markets have hit an incredibly low point. And we are really past the point of containers making it in for Christmas. So naturally, we do expect a small softening in December, but at every major trade lane, prices are down just substantially. And in some cases, they're actually below the cost, which seems to indicate that we're kind of during a stabilizing point of the supply and demand structure. Let's start off, let's look at the China to US West Coast lane first. Now, remember, when we go through these rates, we're strictly looking at the ocean portion, and we're looking at the averages that we have been seeing. So as I mentioned a minute ago, rates, they've been falling substantially. And even though the West Coast lane was a really early mover in this pretty substantial drop in rate prices, it still has actually found more room to drop, which is really crazy. So last week, we saw our price averages sitting at roughly just $1,400 for the ocean portion of a shipment. And technically, this number is not a record-breaking low, but if you factor in just normal yearly inflation, and what I mean by that is not including what we've been seeing this year, not this crazy stuff, but just normal yearly inflation, technically that $1,400 is the lowest we've seen in a very long time, at least, after you do the math. But what's fascinating about this lane is it's got all these factors that are influencing its price. So a few things, we've namely got what's been going on with the West Coast port negotiations. Also, we did a show over this, the trucking legislation with AB5. And then as we've gone through this post-pandemic period, or as we were leaving the pandemic, and obviously China's had their own kind of thing going on, that whole China COVID policy, the zero tolerance policy, has caused just serious whiplash in this lane, which is obviously taken the business community and said, hey, the risk of shipping here is worse than other lanes. So it's got a lot of factors there. And you've got to consider that. But what's weird is the normal high point in prices during a year is, the end of the year. Generally speaking, September through November, we see some very high prices, generally your highest prices of the year, particularly on this lane. Now, what we're actually witnessing, though, this year is the very opposite. So if you go back to October, rates on the West Coast dropped all the way down to 2,400. And at this point, the West Coast labor negotiations were heating up. They weren't terribly bad. Shippers had been moving, obviously, to other lanes, but it sat there at 2,400 literally for months. And this number kind of withstood hundreds, literally hundreds of blank sailings. And it's crazy that it could sit at that low of a number and then still dive even lower than that. Now, before we go into a couple things going on, and there's literally so much going on in the market right now, we're gonna go a mile wide and maybe instead of an inch deep, maybe 4 inches deep today. But there's just a lot to cover, which is important. And make sure in some of your time off, don't get too depressed, but watch some of the news because there's a lot of things happening. But let's quick talk about China shipping over to the East Coast. So if you look at the flip side, the equation's been very different. It's been a lot more stable on the East Coast than it has on the West Coast. $8,000 point was very common. You could actually say if you averaged out the year, it'd be slightly above 8,000, even given what's going on right now with the dropping rates and such. Now, like the other major shipping lanes, the China-US East Coast is also feeling this burden of dwindling demand. And despite the East Coast ports being used really heavily right now and being the most congested ports in the nation, we're seeing this lane go down. I mean, so what we saw is last week, the average cost for our clients in this lane was $3,300. And this is the lowest rate we've seen over the course of 2 years. This is actually a substantially low rate. And what makes this unique is it's actually a 10% drop from the week prior. So it was an acceleration of that dropping point, just like what happened in the West Coast lanes. Now, this is to kind of tie this into some current events. So given the spot rates right now, those kind of rates, they're not 100% spot rates, but they're partially spot rates. Really depends on what client we're working with. So given the condition of the spot rates, carriers, they're in a difficult position when it comes to the contracted rates that they've signed up for. So what happened last year during the contract negotiation period is the ocean shipping lines, they really kind of abused their shipper counterparts and they moved the contract season up than the earlier or conventional May 1st start time. So last year we saw contracts going through in February. And the reason why was there was just high congestion. There was a ton of demand for, obviously that limited number of slots. And at the time, the idea was that people who were willing to sign up to pay honestly, a very high price would get that guaranteed capacity. And it was better than, potentially not even making it on the vessel. So as we're heading now, obviously into the end of the year where rates are in a totally different world, looking back, you've only got 4% of the shippers in those contracts who are still in that agreement. And that's even surprising to me, and that must be due to stipulations. But if you dive deeper into that number, most of the shippers were able to renegotiate those contracts and they're still under contract. But then you've got this new group who always used to be contracted shippers, now hiring individuals to get into the spot market and kind of capitalize on some of these low rates. So they're leaning on their 3PL partners. They're growing their logistics teams to try to do this because they're seeing this disparity between what the ocean liners are offering and where the market's really at. And that's pretty interesting. Now, this does put those ocean liners in a really tough position because the return of demand and the time frame for them as they're kind of looking to what their contract season needs to be competitive, it's all so blurry. And it's really going to be, we've been doing this show for a while. And I remember as we entered 2022 and we were, obviously in the peak of 2021, when we started this show, just to kind of give the general knowledge of what is happening out in the world, because so much was going on. Our customers were confused and it just made sense for us to have a broadcast discussing it. And I remember us looking into 2022 and we actually had quite a few predictions right. The fascinating thing is the steepness at which these rates have fallen was definitely beyond what we expected. And looking at, 2023, you have to imagine that we're going to see whenever there's whiplash in one direction, you get whiplash in another direction. Now, there was the South China Morning Post. They actually put out an article this week that highlighted the Chinese belief essentially for the US economy, and they are expecting us to fall into a conventional recession no later than the second quarter of the upcoming year. And then they expect us to leave that recession no sooner than the fourth quarter of next year. Now, generally speaking, when the US falls into a conventional recession, China's economy slumps afterwards. And this is the general assumption that analysts have been talking about as well. So our take on this and what we're seeing just in the shipping realm, there was an awesome article. I actually put it out on LinkedIn because it was fascinating. But the National Retail Federation, they made a pretty startling prediction, and that was that US retail imports will be down by as much as 20% year over year in February. But you need to remember that part of that is due to this buildup of inventory that we currently have in US warehouses and distribution centers. So it's not necessarily all, you see 20% down year over year, and that is a shocking number, especially when you're talking about just general imports. That's a massive number, but you need to realize it's not entirely demand driven. It's actually just the leveling out of current inventory versus new inventory. Still extremely painful. Now, another factor that was in this same prediction is that holiday sales performance is still expected to rise by at least 8% year over year. Now, I have actually seen this prediction changing just post the whole Black Friday and that sales event. And so what we really have to do, though, is the hard numbers won't come through until about mid-January. And that's when we're going to do a full read on this, and we'll have a discussion. It'll be great. It'll be a really good breakdown, and it will be awesome to help us predict what's going to be happening going forward. Now, there is another bit of news. I know everyone has been really hot on this topic. It's demurrage and detention. Now, what is going on is it does look like the FMC may be making some new rules here in the coming months. They're kind of gearing up to understand how they need to put this together. And 115 shippers left them comments on things that they feel the new ruling needs to focus on. And this happened over the past 2 months. And really the focus of these comments could be broken down into roughly 4 categories. To talk about 3 of them first, shippers want to have some information about situations when the carriers or the terminal invoice for detention or demurrage, and when the appointments to pick up or drop off containers were not available. So they need to have this idea of, okay, why am I getting demurrage and detention if I literally cannot pick up my container because there is no appointment? Another situation that's happened quite often, and if you've experienced this, this is really unfortunate. It's very difficult to go through the dispute process, but sometimes the incorrect party's invoiced for fees, and then it just goes into no man's land. And when you come back to revisit it, it's just through these timelines, and it gets very challenging with that as well. But a final thing that was mentioned by these 115 shippers is just transparency and accuracy for the data points that the shipping lines are using when they are they are assigning demurrage and detention charges. For some reason, demurrage and detention just gets my tongue twisted, so forgive me. Now, one other area, actually, the main area, and this is that 4th thing I left to the separate piece that got a massive amount of attention, was they wanted to make sure shippers were held accountable for the time frame between when a container was charged demurrage or detention and when the shipping line invoiced it. We've been in situations where a container's been charged demurrage or detention and we won't get an invoice for 90 days. And that's crazy. If you think about somebody shipping 300 plus containers a year, and there's one container that got demurged 90 days ago, going through that dispute process and really trying to determine what we can do to eliminate or fight those charges when it's that far back is incredibly challenging. And then especially, I know so many people have been dealing with this right now, given all of the congestion in the ports. Given the current circumstances, it's even more challenging because things are just not as clear. So this is really great news. This is kind of the groundwork for what should be a quality set of rules and at least some standardization. So, there's at least ways you can ship to help you avoid those massive mystery charges. Now, this is really just a taste of all the things happening right now, but we got to move on. So let's go over the transatlantic lanes. And remember, again, we are just focusing on the ocean rate averages. But when you're looking at shipments that are leaving Europe and they're heading into the US East Coast, We're seeing that same slump in rates, which the rest of the world is experiencing. But to be clear, it's happening in a much smaller degree. So our averages came in at the lowest they've been in years. Actually, they broached the $6,000 mark. That actually left us with a price average last week of $59.90. And that's a huge landmark point from what we've seen this lane. And, without a doubt, this lane's had its own unique and substantial challenges, but month over month, compared with the rest of the world, this lane has kind of shown itself to be actually the most stubborn lane to decline. And sometimes it's very unique in its trends. It's got different factors that are kind of moving that needle and keeping it higher than it should be. So if you consider pre-pandemic, this lane was running at roughly $1,500 a container, and that actually made it one of the cheapest shipping lanes. And then if you go back to the pandemic, it never really reached that same level of price pain that the other lanes did. Really, I mean, it did explode over 4 times, much over 4 times, actually. Actually 5 times, so it's smack. I'm gonna have to go back on that. It's maximum high point. But still, if you looked at the other lanes, you were seeing bills in the $20,000 range occasionally coming in from the West Coast. There was that obviously news article about the $32,000 container, which was just unbelievable. But it did not see that same extreme price pain, obviously in the occasional shipment, but not across the board. Now, a couple things you need to factor into this lane and how we're talking about the other rates, and we're talking about this rate. One of the main differences is the transit time's a little bit lower. So rates, they do tend to lag when it comes to dropping off. So keep that in mind. But there are a lot of other factors as well. Now, to take this, hey, this lane's a little bit higher and more, price stable than the rest, and throw in this kind of sprinkling of current events is kind of funny because it's like a direct contradiction. But what is the future of this lane? And this has kind of been talked about recently. So there's been a few analysts and a couple articles going out just looking at what's been happening with ocean shipping. And the expectation is that this transatlantic lane, Europe to US East Coast, is going to see a sharp decline in the coming months. So the reason why, one of the levers that keeps price high is capacity. And shippers, they pull this lever by issuing blank sailings, or essentially just reducing capacity. Now, with softening demand in most of the world's shipping lanes, capacity's kind of just gravitated to where it can be filled. And that has been increasingly in the transatlantic, and also utilizing the US East Coast ports. The problem here is that it's not like there's more demand actually out there or actually in these lanes. It's just that the limited demand out there is kind of siloing itself to certain locations. So it's the best way of putting this is it's kind of like zombie rates. They're not really indicative to the market as a whole. It's just how capacity has aligned at the moment. Now, this is going to kind of, there's differing opinions on this, but it likely will cause this sharp decline in rates simply because if you look at the year over year, North Europe to North America capacity growth, in December, we've had a 43% growth in capacity just in that lane. And then we're expected to have that capacity grow to 48% by February. So there is just a massive shift of capacity going to this area. And as soon as, the shipments catch up, rates will fall. So keep that in mind. Now, I do want to, that's obviously another Titanic shift, which are not fun, and they involve a lot of business risk and uncertainty. So to kind of balance that out with some slightly good news, the persistent strikes that have been happening in the UK port of Felixstowe, they're now more of a thing of the past, at least for the immediate future, because the Felixstowe Dock and Railway Company said in a statement that workers voted and they accepted a pay hike of 8.5% for next year. They're also getting a one-time bonus of $1,200. And in a separate deal, workers are also agreed to a 7% raise covering 2022. And that's going to be accompanied by another 1%, one-time payment of $600. So that is at least behind us. If you remember, some of the Felixstowe strikes were terrible because they were always long and they were always very last minute in comparison to what's been happening on the West Coast, and in some of the situations, they've been a little bit more planned for the most part. AB5 had a couple ones pop up, and we also had the Oakland situation. Now, let's move on to our next and final ocean lane we're going to be covering. This is China to Europe. And conventionally, I love this lane. I love talking about this lane. It's a great barometer for the market in general. It's kind of been old faithful even throughout the pandemic. And over the past 2 years, while this lane was extremely high in price, it was very consistent. It didn't fluctuate like the other lanes did. You'd see, obviously, your Europe to North American East Coast lane going all over the place. The same thing was happening with the West Coast, but the China to Europe lane was extremely price consistent. Without a doubt, the most price consistent lane that we saw over the pandemic. High, but price consistent. Now, what's been happening is over the past few months, this lane's been on a steady but gradual decline in price. This was gradual up into just the last few weeks, and that's when our averages, they really just dropped off a cliff. So to illustrate this point, 3 weeks ago, our price averages were sitting at just over $4,000. 2 weeks ago, our price averages were literally just under $4,000. And then in the course of the week following, so 2 weeks ago to last week, we had a drop of 18%, and the prices are down to 3,200. So as you can see, we have used this as a little bit of a barometer, and this sharp decline is indicative of another sharp decline to come, particularly on the East Coast lane. Now, there's a lot of things to unpack here. There truly is quite a lot. China is one of the more upstream locations when it comes to supply. Obviously, India is as well. But not only does China provide a lot of finished goods, they also provide a lot of components or near raw goods. So lowering demand is going to hit them earlier. It's going to hit them a little bit harder. Carriers are also manipulating capacity to try to kind of prop up their revenue in the Trans-Pacific lanes. But what's happened is it's made it harder to lock in good, reliable transit times for shippers. So it's kind of causing shippers to look other routes. And what's been happening as well is US manufacturers actually placed 40% less orders to Chinese factories this quarter. So it's down that whopping 40%, which is just nuts. And then obviously, to put the cherry on top of this whole situation, everything that's been going on with China and COVID. And unfortunately, there has just been so much happening, and I've been getting news from so many different areas. I really don't want to talk about COVID too much because I don't have a clear quality view of the timeline, the facts, and what events are important and what are kind of propped up, if that makes sense. But there is one thing I do want to mention. There's currently a closed door meeting happening. It literally just started today. It's going today and tomorrow. It's got President Xi. And at the end of this meeting, it is expected that there will be some changes to the zero COVID policy. So that's going to be happening next week. Keep your eyes peeled for that. Not guaranteed, but the meeting is quite focused around the economic policies of China and how this is going to change going forward, given COVID, and also even kind of teetering into the oil and gas realm. So keep your eyes peeled for that. It's going to be incredibly important news. Now, we got to jump into air. Let's jump into air. So here's the deal. When we're looking specifically at air rates out of China into the US, we are still seeing that seesaw effect. We mentioned the seesaw effect in the past. If you're working on putting an air shipment out there, it's great to give your shipper a lot of notice because there's actually a lot of power to kind of capitalize when the rate is lower. Throughout the month, you see the rate go up and down week after week. Now, we're seeing that actually less than normal. It's starting to kind of stabilize. But right now, the price is around $5.50 a kilo. That's what we've been seeing for our clients last week. Now, if you go over to Europe, the European air shipments coming to the US, we have seen a slight increase in price, but Europe has always been extremely consistent when it comes to air freight and air cargo rates. Obviously, again, you have just a shorter distance in general, so the costs are different. You also have just a lot more capacity flying back and forth regularly. So that does all influence that. Last week, our clients averaged $3.25 a kilo. And lastly, if you're looking at our South American freight or our air freight, shipping from Latin America, we unfortunately aren't seeing the all-time lows we were seeing just about 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks to a month ago, actually. We were seeing rates as low as $1.50 a kilo. And unfortunately, those are not here anymore. Last week for our clients, we're seeing an average of roughly, and this is kind of unfortunately it's not a good average, unfortunately, but roughly $2.36 a kilo. Fuel right now, diesel has actually been in a great spot. We saw a 20%, excuse me, not 20%, 20-cent decline in the cost of diesel across the US week over week. So we are seeing a steep decline right now. We're averaging across the full US 475 a gallon. And that is what we got scheduled today. A mile wide, 4 inches deep. But yeah, just there is so much happening. We've got so much to unpack. I cannot wait for January because that's when all the data comes out and we get to really take a great look at, hey, what happened 2021? What happened 2022? What are our expectations for 2023? All right, Vanessa, you want to dive on in?
Talking to the mute button. Yes, yes, yes. First of all, I have a couple of Merry Christmas messages. So
oh, thank you.
I think your hat was a success as well. Got a couple messages on that. And I do have I see one question and one show request actually for next year already.
Nice.
Judy's asking if we could have a show on supply chain trends for 2023. And yeah, that's in the making.
We need to. And honestly, Judy, if you could fire out, shoot this over to us an email. Just send us over a couple things you're particularly interested in to make sure that we include them in that breakdown. And, hey, if they even merit a full show on those specific things, we'll just do it in 2 shows. We need to be doing that. We need to be doing that probably quarterly, given how violent the market has been these past couple of years.
Exactly. And the question that I have here is, it seems that the market is slowing, getting back to pre-pandemic levels. Is the Chinese New Year coming to mess things up again?
Oh man, Chinese New Year is really tough right now. Okay, so Chinese New Year this year is earlier than normal, but also it's expected that Chinese factories are going to shut down 2 weeks earlier than Chinese New Year this year due to the lack of demand. So it is going to be really fascinating. If you're shipping out of China, you got to keep your eyes on this. Literally, this popped out this week. Yeah, Chinese New Year. It's happening in January this year. So just keep that in mind. And literally, there's a lot of Chinese factories shutting down that 2 weeks early. So if you need freight out of China, you're expecting it in Q1. Right now is the time you have to dive in. We can obviously help you guys out with that. I did also mention though, what we're seeing with the West Coast is that, as these shipping lines, they're trying to kind of prop up the revenue. The problem is the reliability of the shipping times has been really poor. Capacity is just it's not distributed well right now, even though people aren't shipping the lane. It's kind of a negative, right? Because now, they're not prioritizing the lane. So if you need cargo out of China, really try to get it in this week if possible.
Awesome. Well, I guess that's it for the year regarding our ship show. Thank you so much for joining us for the entire year. And we have a lot coming in the new year. We don't want to give any spoilers, right, Jason? But Jason,
if you didn't say that, I would have started giving spoilers. So I'm really glad you said that because I'm too excited for it. So get ready. I almost just said one right there. Oh my gosh, I gotta restrain myself.
Okay, yeah. So we need to stop then. Merry Christmas, everyone. Thank you,
Merry
Jason,
Christmas.
for so
Thank
much.
you so much for joining us.